When I was in college, or now we usually call it university, many years ago, I had the privilege of talking to several of Ellen White's grandchildren. And one of the questions that I asked, and it wasn't just grandchildren, I talked to other people too that remembered Ellen White. This was about 52 years after Ellen White had died. So there were still a number of people living in California where I grew up and went to school who remembered Ellen White, had personal recollections. And one question I asked over and over was, did you ever receive a message from Ellen White based on a vision? And they all told me no, except for Ellen White's oldest granddaughter, Ella White Robinson. And here's the story she told me. They were living in Australia. Ellen White had her home at Sunnyside, right near Avondale College. And Willie White, Ella's father, had his house. Their family was living across the road, up the road a little ways from Sunnyside. And the school was just getting started. And there really were not any hotels or motels. When people wanted to come and learn about the new schools, decide whether or not to send their children there, why, there was no place for them to stay. So they ended up staying in the homes of some of the faculty members, or according to Ella, the number one place people wanted to stay was Ellen White's house. Now that says a lot about Ellen White as a hostess, if you want to stay there. But in fact, she had so much company. In one letter, she says, I think I'm going to put a sign on the front of my house that says free lodging. I mean, everybody's coming, so why not just do it? Anyway, Ella said that if Ellen White's house was already full, then she said it seemed like people wanted to stay at our place. And of course, when you have company, what does that mean? A lot of extra work. I mean, there's extra laundry that has to be done, food that has to be prepared, even the kerosene lamps, all the chimneys have to have the smoke taken off of them. And Ella said that one of her jobs was scouring the great big kettles or the pots that they cooked in. They had a wood stove, and these things would get smoke on the bottom of them, and she'd have to take them out behind the house. They had a sand pile, and she had to scour off all the smoke. And she said she hated it, just hated it. And with all this company, she said her friends, her classmates, they had a little church school, she said they didn't have all that company. So they didn't have all that work. And she said, I got to thinking, this is really unfair. Now, I remember she was a teenager at this time. She said, this really was unfair, and I was so unhappy. So she said, I began to pray to God that God would impress my grandmother, Ellen White, to tell my mother not to have me do so many chores. And because that's a fair prayer. I mean, maybe not fair, but it's not an unusual prayer for a teenager, I suppose, to ask. So this is what she's praying. And she said not long after she started praying this prayer, one day Grandma came across the road. Now, what usually happened, she said, when her grandmother was not traveling, was home in the morning after breakfast at her house, then she would come across the road to her son's house, and they would all gather in the parlor for a short time, and they would all visit. And normally, they kind of had it just kind of unknown feeling that when they got to a certain point in the conversation, then Ella and her younger sister Mabel would take the little twin brothers that they had, well, they were actually half brothers. Willie had remarried. By this time, Ella's mother had died, so these were half brothers. But they would take the little babies in the other room and play with them so that Grandma could visit some more with Papa and Mama before she went back to her own home to work for the day. So this morning, Ella said, Grandma was visiting, and everything seemed like it was that point when Mabel and I should take our twin brothers into the other room. And so we started to do that, and Grandma said, no. She said, I have a message for the family. Well, Ella said, I realized this was a different visit than what Grandma usually has. So she said her grandmother reached in her purse, or she called it a satchel. She reached in her satchel and brought out this manuscript, and she began to read. And the first part of it was counsel to Willie, to her son, Willie White. And Ella said, that was fine. Grandma wasn't talking to me, she was talking to my father. I've been showing you should do this and do that and the other thing. And then after a little bit, her grandmother started reading to May's stepmother, to Willie's wife. And Ella said, that's no problem, wasn't to me. But she kept reading. After a while, she said, grandmother started saying, now Ella, I have been shown, or I guess she didn't choose, I was been shown. She said, she started giving advice about what Ella should be doing. Her mother is so busy with all this company and everything that, Ella, you should help your mother more. You should help lift her burdens. And she said, I was sitting there, I was getting so angry, this seemed so unfair. I'd just been praying to God, impressed my mother not to ask me to do so many chores. And here's Grandma saying, I should do even more. And she said, as her grandmother kept reading about how important it is, no matter how little and insignificant something seems that we've been asked to do, we should do everything to the best of our ability. She said, I was so angry. She said, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, Jim, but I shouted out, I called out to my mother, or to my grandmother, did you just make that up, or did the angel really tell you all that? And she said, her grandmother said, I didn't put anything in here except what the angel has shown me. She said, I was so mad. Then she said, Grandma read a little bit more and had some advice from my younger sister, Mabel. But she said, I don't know anything about what that was about. I was so mad, I could just hardly wait for Grandma to get out of there. And she said, as soon as grandmother left to go back to her own home, she said, I ran to my bedroom and I began to sob. This was so unfair. And she said, I cried and I sobbed. This seemed so unfair. I've been praying to God to impress my mother to do less. And here Grandma says, God says, I'm supposed to be doing more. And she said, as I was there crying on my bed, she said, all of a sudden the thought came to me, that's the answer to your prayer. She said, it's not the answer I wanted, but it's the answer to my prayer. And I can still see this little, very short woman, very frail woman who was in her 80s when she was telling me this story. Her thin little finger pointing towards heaven as she said, the thought came to me that the great God of heaven had taken time from all that he does running the universe to send an angel down here to my grandmother to answer my prayer. Just a little teenager, answer my prayer. She said, I have been eternally grateful ever since, but I'm embarrassed to admit that was not my first reaction. She said, I dried my eyes. I remembered there was a big kettle out in that sand pit out behind the house. I went out there, she said, and I gave that kettle the best scrubbing I ever gave any pot or pan in my life. But it was a good lesson for me, because if you talked to Ella very long, you knew that she was thoroughly in love with her grandmother. She had nothing but warm memories of her grandmother. And yet when a message from God came that cut across what she wanted to do, what was her first reaction? It was anger, it was upset. It's not what I want to hear. None of us have the privilege of having known Ellen White. Everyone that knew her is now sleeping, waiting for the resurrection. And so we don't have that personal knowledge. And sometimes when we read things, we do find it hard. And sometimes we're tempted, or sometimes we do react in a negative way. But when, like Ella, finally it dawns on our minds, but these are messages that God sent. They are answers to our prayers. They will help us live a better life. It will help us in our walk towards the holy city. I think it helps keep everything in perspective.